Maseches Kiddushin Daf Samach Zayin. We begin with the Mishnah at the bottom of Daf Samach Vav, which introduces the topic of Yuchsin, that is ancestry. When we calculate or we reckon the ancestry of a child and his halachic status, do we follow the mother, the father, or some other way of determining what status he would be? The Mishnah is going to give us 4 rules. For each rule, it will give a number of examples. It's going to use a phrase for each one. It's going to say, this is the rule, and here are examples. And the Gemara will discuss, are there other examples, and is the rule a complete rule? And we will bring other examples and see whether they fit in the rule or whether they are exceptions to the rule. So let's begin. So here are the 4 rules for Yochsin. Rule number 1 is any situation in which the marriage is a kosher, legal marriage. It's Teifis Kiddushin, and there is no Aveira involved. The halacha is that the genealogy of the child follows that of the father. The example is a Kohenes Levi or Yisraelis that marries a Kohen, Levi, or Yisrael. In all those situations, the child will be whatever the father is. Next rule, second rule, is wherever there is Kiddushin, the Kiddushin is Tevis, but there is an Aveira. There, the rule is whatever is causing the problem, whatever is causing the Aveira, whatever the Pagam, whatever the lack is, the child will get that Pagam, whether it's the mother or the father. What's an example of that? So the Mishnah brings an Almana marrying a Kohen Gadol, a Gush v'Chalutza marrying a Kohen Hedid, a Mamzeres or a Nesina marrying Yisrael, or a Bas Yisrael marrying a Mamzer or a Nesin. All those situations, the child will either be a Chalal or a Chalala, like the whichever one was the Chalal, or it'll be a Mamzer or a Nesin, like whichever one was the Mamzer or the Nesin. Now, third case is where there is no Tfisas Kiddushin, but only because of this relationship. There's no Tfisas, there is Tfisas, this man could marry anyone else, and this woman could marry other people, but their relationship together is a problem. That, the halacha is that the child's a mamzer automatically. And what are those examples? So for that, the Mishnah says it's anyone that the Torah calls an erva, that's all the forbidden relationships, as well as an eshes ish. The last halacha is that there's no Tfisas Kiddushin at all for any of these individuals. One of the people in this marriage, in this relationship, cannot marry any Jew at all. There, the halacha is that the child follows the mother. An example of that is a shifcha and a nachris. Okay, now we begin the Gemara, and the Gemara wants to discuss how accurate this rule is. So we'll have a few types of questions we'll ask. First of all, we set a rule. Each of these rules, are there things which fit the rule but don't fit the halacha? So the rule then wouldn't be accurate. On the other hand, we have a list of examples. Is the list of examples complete? Or are there other things which should technically be on the list that aren't? And that would indicate that the list is meant to exclude some things. And that would explain why something fits the rule, but is not on the list, because it's not on the list of examples, and the halacha is not true there. I mean, these two things will work together. If you find me something which fits the rule, but is not that the halacha is not true, if it's not mentioned in the list of examples, the list would be excluding it. But then we would have to see what is the list for, and why are things being excluded. So let's begin. So the first rule, as we spoke about, was anything where there is Tfisas Kiddushin and there's no Aveira. We said the child has the yichus of the father, so the Gemara says it's not entirely true. What about the situation of a ger who marries a mamzeres? A ger, according to one opinion at least, is allowed to marry a mamzeres, because the ger is not called Yisrael, is not called kahal, as far as halacha of lo yovi mamzer bekahal. So there is Kiddushin. According to this opinion, there is no Avera, and yet the child is a mamzer. So it follows the pugum, it doesn't follow the father. If the mother would be the mamzeres, as we have in this example, then it would be a mamzeres and not follow the father and be a kosher. So the Gemara says this Mishnah is going like the other opinion, and that's a machlekes. Gemara quotes the Brisa. According to Rabbi Yossi, a ger is allowed to marry a mamzeres, although the child is a mamzer. According to Rabbi Yehuda, a ger is not allowed to marry a mamzeres, and therefore this would fit in the rule of yesh kiddushin v'yesh avera, and therefore it makes sense that the child follows the pugum. It doesn't fit in the first rule. Asks the Gemara, then it should be on the list. And the second rule of things which have yesh kiddushin and yesh avera, we should add a ger marrying a mamzeres. So the Gemara says, well, it says kol makom. It says this is the rule. That's to include things that, although they're not mentioned in the list of examples, they are still included in that halacha. This is all the Gemara's first answer to the original Akasha. The Gemara gives a second answer, and the Gemara says, really, we're in Rabbi Yossi's opinion. Even though you found me an example of something which is Kiddushin and no Aveira, and does not fit into the halachic rule that it should have the yichus of the father, that's why there's a list of examples. The list of examples is to tell you the rule is not complete. The rule only applies in these examples. Other cases like the one you found, the rule doesn't fit. Says the Gemara, okay, then I have a kasha on you the opposite way. You mean to tell me that the only situation in which the rule of where there's Kiddushin and there's no Aveira, that you follow the father, is this list of examples? It's not true. There's another example which is not mentioned. So I assumed before you gave me some examples, not all the examples. Now you're telling me, no, these are the only situations in which this rule applies. What about an additional situation? And that is a cholol who marries a bas Yisrael, where the halacha is that there is tfisa kedushin. A cholol is allowed to marry a bas Yisrael. There's no problem there. And the halacha is that the child is a chol like the father. So that should fit into the rule. Why is it not on the list of examples if you're telling me that the examples are the complete list? So the Gemara answers this Mishnah holds like Rabbi Distoy ben Rabbi Yehuda, who holds that a chol marries the bas Yisrael. The child is not a chol. The child is a kosher, what we call mikveh Yisrael. Benois Yisrael are mikveh l'kahanim. Says the Gemara, okay, my kasha comes right back. If I flip the case, Yisrael who marries a chalala, male Yisrael marries a female chalala, mutter, yesh kedushin, ein aveira, and the halach is that the child follows the zachar, the child is kosher. So why then is this not on the list of examples if this rule applies here? So the Gemara answers, you're right, not every example is mentioned. We said kol malkaim to show that there is at least one case which is not in the list of examples, which is included to the words kol ha-malkam. So the Gemara says, okay, so then why don't you just list them all together? Why do you have to include it with a phrase kol malkam? If you know the list and it's on the list, so list it. So the Gemara says, no, because it's difficult to phrase it. We wanted to be able to say Kohanes Leviah Yisraelis, then marry each other, a Kohen Leviah, a female Kohen Levi Yisrael, or a male Kohen Levi Yisrael who marry each other is all fine. We're going to add chalal in there, we're going to add Yisraelis and chalal in there. Not going to work because a chalal is not allowed to marry a kohen. That wouldn't be an ein aveira. That would be a yesh aveira. So therefore, that would mess up the way we wanted to phrase the Mishnah. Therefore, we just said, okay, you know what? We'll include the phrase kol malkam. Says the Gemara, okay, I have another example of something which should be on the list of examples of yesh kedushin and ein aveira, and the child follows the zachar, and that's the case of Rabbi Bar Bachana, which is a mitzri sheni that marries a mitzris rishonim. Now the halacha is that a mitzri is only allowed to marry a yisrael if they are a third generation. That means the mitzri who converts, who becomes a ger, is called a mitzri rishon. That person's child is a mitzri sheni, still also to marry a yisrael. That person's child, the grandchild of the original convert, that's a mitzri shlishi. That person is allowed to marry a yisrael. Therefore, you have to know generationally where someone fits. So here you have a second generation mitzri that his father converted, who married a mitzris who converted herself. What is the halach of the son? Is the son a third generation or a second generation? Third following the father, and therefore wanted to marry Israel, or second following the mother. And the halach of Rabbi Bar Bachana is that it's a third, and then she follows the father. So you see, therefore, that you have yesh kedushin ein aveira, and this fits the rule, but it's not on the list of examples. The Gemara says again, kol malkaim is to include this. Says the Gemara, what are you going to do with Rav Dimi, who holds that this case follows the mother? It doesn't fit the rule. The Gemara says, okay, it doesn't fit the rule because it's not on a list of examples. The list of examples is to exclude this. That's why we have a list of examples. Says the Gemara, okay, we have another thing that should technically be yesh kedushin and ein aveira and doesn't fit the rule, because here the child follows the pugum, not the zachar, not the father. What's that example? So Gemara quotes Ravin and Rav Yechanan. It says if you have two umos ha'olam, two goyim who marry each other and then they convert. So when they marry each other before they convert, the halacha is they follow the zachar, they follow the father. What's the nafkamina in halacha? The Gemara will discuss that later. After they convert, they follow the pugum. So here you have another example of following the pugum, not following the father. So again, this doesn't fit the rules. So the Gemara answers, yeah, that's why it's left off the list. That's why we have the list. The list of the specific ones, only this and not that. Okay, so bottom line, what we have in the first rule, we have certain things which fit the rule, but the halacha is not true, and that's why they are left off the list. There's an ezazu, there's a list of examples, and they're left off. And then there are other things which are left off the list, but they fit the rule, and they fit the halacha, and therefore it says kol malkam to include them, even though they're not on the list. Now that we have that list according to Rabbi Yehuda and Kontragesi. Now let's look at the second rule, where we said where there is Kiddushin, but there also is an Aveira, and the halacha of that rule is that it follows the pugum, and we have the question of what do you do with the case of the ger who marries a mamzeres. The halacha there is that the child is a mamzer, which means that it's following a pogum, which is the second rule. Now, does it fit into the second rule? That should depend on the machlokes between Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Yehuda. According to Rabbi Yehuda, this is a classic second rule because there is an aveira. According to Rabbi Yossi, this is not a second rule. This is a case of no aveira. Now, according to Rabbi Yehuda, this should be in the second rule, but it's not on the list of examples, and that would be why it says kol makom. To include this, even though it's not on the list of examples. According to Rabbi Yossi, however, why does it say kol makom? There is nothing which belongs on the second list that's not there. A ger and mamzeres doesn't belong on that list. Now, according to Rabbi Yehuda, have a problem as well, and that's because it says ezozu that this is an exclusive list to show that there are things which fit the rule. Yet, the halacha is not correct. Now, there isn't anything on the list. There's nothing that's yesh Kiddushin and yesh Aveira that doesn't fit the rule of following the pigam. So, what then is that ezezu for? So, the Gemara says, therefore, we're going to have to say that the kol makom, according to Rabbi Yossi, and the ezezu, according to Rabbi Yehuda, and according to Rabbi Yossi, is not really including anything. That's just there. Agav, we said it in the first rule, so we said it in the second rule as well. Okay, now, the Gemara goes deeper into the halacha of Rabban, the name of Rabbi Yochanan, who said that in the Ummos you follow the Zachar. So one Ummah marries another Ummah. Which Ummah does the child belong to? Follows the father. So Gemara says, what is that relevant to and what halacha is that? So that's as far as the halacha of the Shiva Ummos and other Ummos of the world. The Shiva Ummos is Leisachai Kol Neshama, you're not allowed to take them as an Eved. Other Ummos, you are allowed to take them as an Eved, there's no Leisachaya. So if you have a Kenani, which is Lo Sachai, who marries someone from a different the child follows the father. Either way. Now, where do you see this halacha? So Mark quotes the pasuk. It says, "V'gam mibnei teshavim hagar mimachem." For those who live, if you have the ones who live with you, mehem tiknu, you're allowed to have the halacha of the eved there. But it says, "Asher holidu ba'artzachem," that are born in your land. So the Gemara understands that this is to include a situation where you have a mixed marriage from one to another, and what usually happens is that the child is born in the place where the mother lives, and then he goes to live with the father. So Asher Helidu Ba'artzachem means that the mother is Kanani, and the father is from a different and therefore it's only Asher that are born Ba'artzachem, not that were born somewhere else and came to live in Artzachem. We're only referring to that were born in Artzachem and went to somewhere else. That means that the father's from a different and the mother's a Kanani. It's the only situation in which you could be Mechai them and be Konetz and Eved, and that's because you're following the father. However, if it would be the opposite, where if it was a Kenani who marries from a different a woman, and the child's born there, and then moves to Canaan, moves to Eretz Yisrael to live here, you would follow the father as well, and it would be Kanani, and then we would apply Lo Yisachaya. Next, we said that once they convert, the halacha would be that the child follows the more pagam of the two parents. Everyone wants to know, what is this halacha referring to? What pagam is there? What halacha is there after a akum converts? The Gemara says it's referring to an amoini and a mitzri. The halacha is that a mitzri can only join Klal Yisrael after 3 generations, and amoini can never join Klal Yisrael through marriage. How do we determine the halachic status of the child when you have a mixture between an amoini and a mitzri? So we have to be referring to a situation, first of all, where there is a pagam on both. Both pagamim apply, because there's the more pagam of the two. So we can't be referring to an amoinis, because an amoinis is always allowed to marry into Yisrael. There is no pagam. So I have to be talking about an amoini marrying a mitzris. Amoini marrying a mitzris, what's the halacha of the child? So the more pagam of the two. So if the child is a female, the more pagam would be the mother, because you have amoini and mitzris. If the child will be an amoini, then she'll be an amoinis, she'll be mutter completely. So she'll have to follow the mother who's a mitzris. If, however, the child is a zachar, so here an amoini would be more chamar, because the amoini is forbidden forever, while the mitzris is only forbidden for 3 years. So here the child would follow the father, who would be an amoini and have a permanent iser. Okay, we now begin a new sugya, which is that of all the arayas that the Torah lists, what is the source that there's no tfisas Kiddushin in all of them? So the Gemara begins by quoting Rav Chiya bar Abba named Rav Yochanan, or some say it's Rav Yanai, and Rav Acha, the son of Rava, and some say that it's Rav Yossi HaGlili. And the source is because it says that a woman who is divorced should leave her husband's house and go to an ish achar, to a stranger. She can marry a stranger. She can't marry a relative, meaning she can't marry a relative of her husband, not her husband and not her husband's relative, a stranger. So the Gemara says, therefore, that excludes all the other arayas. So the Gemara says, well, hold on a second, maybe it's only to exclude the closest relative of her husband, which would be her husband's son. And therefore, this would be an isser for a man to marry his father's wife, his father's ex-wife, and for a woman to marry her ex-husband's son. How do you know this applies to other arayas? Maybe just the closest one. So the Gemara says, no, that one you wouldn't need a pasuk for. That one says explicitly. It says, L'yikach ishes aviv. The man cannot marry his father's wife. So what is learned from Acher? That's to teach me all kinds of other relationships. So Gemara says, maybe not. Maybe it's to teach you that there's no Tfisa Kiddushin. Maybe when it says that it's usher to marry one's father's wife, that's saying that you may not go and do that. But it doesn't say that if you did do that it's not Teifes, that it's not Chal. And therefore we possibly need that it should say La'achirim v'loy l'kroivim le'ish Acher, and not to Karev, to show that it doesn't work at all. Says the Gemara, now you don't need a pasuk to tell me lechatchila not to marry. That it couldn't be what it's for, because you see the Torah says not to marry one's achos ishta, one's wife's sister. It says loy yikach, and therefore you can't do that lechatchila. And you can learn from there, if you can't marry that situation where there's kares, certainly where there's misa as vezdin, you for sure can't marry. So the isra lechatchila says from there. I don't need the isra lechatchila here. So it says Gemara, okay, so I understand, yes, you have from there, but here when it says that b'diavad there's no Kiddushin, still maybe it's only talking about the achos isha. Maybe it's only referring to that situation where the Torah specifically says lo yikach. You want to learn from there to everywhere else that there's also lo yikach. But the b'diavad that it's not chal is only in the situation where the Torah said explicit, not in the situation that you learned from. Says Gemara, okay, so the pasuk is only telling me about achos isha, but I can learn from achos isha to everywhere else. Let's see. What is the mamatzinu b'achos isha? She's an erva. There's kares for a mazid. There's chatas for a shegig, and there's no tfisas kiddushin. So anything which is an erva has kares and chatas should also have no tfisas kiddushin. Says the Gemara, okay, that works for a lot of things, but it should not work for eshes ish and eshes ach. Why? Because eshes ach, you have a situation which becomes mutter. In the case of a mitzvah, that is yibum, eshes ach becomes mutter. You don't have that by achos ishta. In the case of eshes ish, there is heter during her lifetime. And you don't have that by achos ishta. Achos ishta is only heter after she dies. One is allowed to marry his wife's sister after the death of his wife, not after the divorce of his wife. So therefore, you should have a pircha for both eshes ish and eshes ach. Says the Gemara, okay, Rav Yoina says, and possibly Rav Huna, Rav Yeshua, new source. It says, we put together all arayos together with achos isha. Achos isha is the one where it's mentioned specifically. All the arayos, are all together. And just like achos isha has no tfisas kiddushin, and all the other arayos, therefore, don't have any tfisas kiddushin. Asks the Gemara, if that's true, so then why isn't a nida included? The entire parsha of Arayas includes all the relationships, and it also has a nida listed there. So nida should be also linked to the rest of the Arayas, and should also have no tfisas kiddushin, and the child of a nida should also be a mamzer. So the Gemara answers, Abayi says, everybody agrees that somebody who has been with a nida or with a saita does not create mamzeros, as we have seen. Saita is a lav, and even Rabbi Akiva, who holds that there is mamzeris and no tfisas kiddushin on a lav, Rabbi Akiva agrees that a saita does not create mamzeris. And everybody agrees by a nida, which is kares, that it does not, although it's kares, it does not create mamzeris, and there is tfisas kiddushin. There's tfisas kiddushin, chupas nida is a good kiddushin. Where do you see that? So Chizkiah says, the pasuk says, vatihi nidasa olav, that the time of nida still has the vatihi, there's still havaya, there's still kiddushin. It can still be chal during the nida period itself. If there's tfisas kiddushin, then there's no mamzeris. Those two halachas go together always. So the Gemara then says, okay, so we have the Torah explicitly telling me that there's no tfisas kiddushin by an achos isha, that there is tfisas kiddushin by a nida, and you have all the arayos linked together. How do you know which of those two you should link everything else to? Maybe everything else should be linked to nida, and there is tfisas kiddushin, and there's no mamzeris. How do we know to link it to achos isha, and there is no tfisas kiddushin, and there is mamzeris? So the Gemara answers, if you could be makish for a kula and a chumrah, stricter and more leniently, you always make the hegesh in the stricter way. And therefore we make the hegesh l'chumrah, which means that there is no tfisas kiddushin. We link to achos isha, and all the other arayos have no tfisas kiddushin, and they do create mamzerim.